blizzard howled through the night as Derek Matthews shoved his wife Elena and their newborn twins out into the freezing darkness. Completely unaware his wife had just inherited the royal family fortune worth billions, but Elena clutched her crying babies tighter as snow slashed her face, watching her husband slam the door on 8 years of marriage without a second glance. But what Derek didn't know was that the sleek black limousine pulling up to the roadside wasn't a coincidence, and the woman who stepped out wearing a crown and royal insignia would change everything. But the man who abandoned his family in the snow was about to discover that the person who picked his wife up wasn't just anyone. It was someone whose identity would terrify him to his core. But what Elena would do with her newfound power and fortune would crush Derek in ways he never imagined possible. But who was this mysterious royal figure who arrived at the exact moment Elena needed saving? But what had Elena truly inherited, and why had it been kept secret from her all these years? But what would Derek do when he discovered the truth about the woman he left freezing in the snow with their children? The wind cut through the thin fabric of Elena's coat like 1,000 frozen knives, but the cold wasn't what made her knees buckle on the ice-covered sidewalk. But it was the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place behind her, the final metallic punctuation mark on her marriage that made her entire body go numb. But she stood there in the swirling snow at 3 a.m, 2 bundled newborns pressed against her chest, watching the only home she'd known for 8 years go dark window by window. But Derek Matthews wasn't the man she'd married anymore. But somewhere between the third mortgage payment they couldn't make and the hospital bills from the twins' complicated delivery, he'd transformed into someone unrecognizable. But the man who'd once promised to love her through poverty and wealth had just proven those vows meant nothing when tested by actual hardship. But Elena had seen it coming for months. The way he'd started working late, the mysterious phone calls, the smell of expensive perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his shirts. But what she hadn't seen coming was this moment. But the betrayal wasn't just in the abandonment, it was in the timing. But their daughters, Lily and Rose, were only 6 days old, still so fragile that every breath seemed like a miracle. But Derek had looked at them that evening with something worse than hatred, with complete indifference. "But I can't do this anymore," he'd said, his voice flat and emotionless as he'd packed his belongings. "But you wanted these kids, not me. But figure it out yourself." But Elena had pleaded, had reminded him of everything they'd built together. But she'd shown him the hospital bills, the eviction notice, the empty refrigerator. But she'd asked for just one more week, just enough time to find her footing. But Derek had responded by throwing her coat at her, along with the diaper bag, and physically pushing her toward the door. "But get out," he'd said. "But this is my apartment now, but my name's on the lease." But technically, he was right. But Elena had made the mistake of trusting him completely, of putting his name on everything when they'd moved in together years ago. But she'd been so in love, so certain their bond was unbreakable. But now she understood that paperwork mattered more than promises, and she had nothing. No legal claim to the home, no money, no family to turn to. But her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19. But she'd been an only child, orphaned and alone, working 3 jobs to put herself through community college when she'd met Derek. But he'd seemed like her salvation then, stable, employed, interested in building a future. But she'd dropped out of school to support his career ambitions, had worked as a waitress and house cleaner to pay for his certifications and training. But once he'd landed his job at the tech company, he'd convinced her to quit working and focus on their future family. But that future was supposed to include him. But instead, she was alone with 2 infants in a blizzard, watching her breath crystallize in the air. But Lily started crying first, a thin wail that pierced through the wind. But Rose joined in seconds later, and Elena felt panic rising in her throat. But she had $23 in her wallet, a phone with 5% battery, and no one to call. But the homeless shelter she'd researched online during one of Derek's working late nights was 7 miles away. But in this weather with 2 newborns, it might as well have been 700. But Elena started walking anyway, because staying still meant freezing to death. But each step was agony, her body still healing from the cesarean section, the stitches pulling with every movement. But the twins were getting heavier by the minute, or maybe her arms were just getting weaker. But she'd made it 2 blocks when she had to stop, pressing herself against a closed storefront to catch her breath. But the babies were screaming now, their cries barely audible over the roaring wind. But Elena's tears froze on her cheeks as she realized she might not make it. But this might be where her story ended, on a freezing sidewalk in a forgotten neighborhood, another tragic statistic. But that's when she saw the headlights. But at first, she thought it was just a car passing by, another person safe and warm who wouldn't spare a glance for her desperate situation. But the vehicle slowed as it approached, and Elena's first instinct was fear. But nothing good happened to vulnerable women on dark streets at 3 in the morning. But she tried to keep walking, to pretend she hadn't noticed. But the car, no, not a car, a limousine, sleek and black and impossibly out of place in this working class neighborhood, pulled up beside her and stopped. But the back window rolled down, and Elena clutched her babies tighter, preparing to run despite knowing she didn't have the strength. But the woman who looked out at her from the warmth of that luxury vehicle made Elena's breath catch for an entirely different reason. But she was elderly, perhaps 70, with silver hair swept into an elegant bun. But she wore a navy coat with gold buttons, and even in the darkness, Elena could see the glint of jewelry that spoke of wealth beyond measure. But most striking was what rested on the woman's head, an actual tiara, small but unmistakable, its diamonds catching the streetlight. "But Elena Rosewood?" the woman asked, her voice crisp with a British accent. But Elena's maiden name, she hadn't heard it in 8 years. "But Yes," Elena stammered. "But how do you know?" "But get in," the woman interrupted, but not unkindly. "But we have much to discuss, but first, those babies need warmth." But the driver, a large man in a black suit, had already stepped out and opened the rear door. But every instinct told Elena this was dangerous, impossible, wrong. But people didn't just appear in royal limousines knowing your maiden name. But this had to be a trap, a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by hypothermia. But Lily let out another weak cry, and Elena felt how cold her daughter's tiny body had become through the blanket. "But please," the woman said, and something in her eyes, something desperate and pleading, made Elena's decision. But she let the driver help her into the car, the warmth hitting her like a physical force. But the woman immediately produced heated blankets, wrapping them around the twins with practiced efficiency. "But there's a bottle warmer there," she said, pointing to a compartment. "But formula and sterile bottles as well. But feed them while we talk." But Elena's hands shook as she prepared the bottles. But the babies latched on hungrily, and she finally looked at the woman who'd saved them. "But who are you?" she asked. "But how did you find me?" "But my name is Catherine Ashford," the woman said. "But Dowager Duchess of Ashford, though that title will mean more to you in a moment." But she pulled out a leather portfolio, opening it to reveal photographs. "But I've been searching for you for 27 years, Elena. But since the day you were born and stolen from the hospital." But Elena stared at the photos, a young couple in formal dress, standing on a palace balcony. But the woman wore a crown, the man a military uniform dripping with medals. "But I don't understand," Elena whispered. "But my parents died when I was 19, but they were David and Michelle Rosewood, middle-class Americans." But The people who raised you were good people, Catherine interrupted gently. But they weren't your biological parents. But they couldn't have children, you see, and they became involved with a private adoption that turned out to be less than legal. But she produced another document, a DNA test with official seals. But you are Elena Victoria Ashford, daughter of Crown Prince James and Princess Margaret of the Ashford royal family. But you were kidnapped from the hospital 24 hours after your birth. But the words didn't make sense. But Elena stared at the document, at the percentages and markers that supposedly proved she was someone else entirely. But this is impossible, she said. But my parents, the Rosewoods, they loved me. But they wouldn't have. But they didn't know, Catherine said firmly. But the adoption was arranged through intermediaries. But they believed they were giving a home to a child whose teenage mother couldn't care for her. But they paid a small fee, perfectly legal on the surface. But by the time we traced the connection, they'd died in that accident, and you'd disappeared into the foster system afterward. But Elena remembered those years, bouncing between homes, aging out of the system at 18 with nothing. But I was never in foster care, she said. But after they died, But you were, Catherine said quietly. But the records were sealed under your legal name, Rosewood. But we were searching for Ashford. But by the time we connected the two, you'd met Derek Matthews and taken his name. But every step you took to move forward in life made you harder to find. But she paused, her eyes softening. But until 3 weeks ago, when you listed your maiden name on the hospital forms for the twins' birth. But the system flagged it, and we've been monitoring the situation since. But 3 weeks? Elena's voice rose. But you've known where I was for 3 weeks, and just watched while... But she gestured at herself, at the situation. But while I lost everything? But we had to be certain, Catherine said. And we had to wait for the right moment. But you were married, Elena. But if we'd revealed everything while you were still with Derek Matthews, he would have had legal claims to your inheritance. But community property laws in this state are quite clear. But the moment he forced you out, the moment he abandoned you... But she paused, and something fierce flashed in her eyes. But that moment he forfeited any right to what you're about to inherit. But Elena felt dizzy, and not just from exhaustion, but inherit. But what are you talking about? But Catherine pulled out another document, this one thick and bound in leather. But your father, Prince James, died 15 years ago, but your mother, Princess Margaret, passed away last year. But they never stopped looking for you, but they never gave up hope. But she opened the document to the first page. But the Ashford royal family has a net worth of approximately $8 billion, but properties in 7 countries, holdings in dozens of major corporations, art collections, jewels accumulated over centuries. But your mother's will was very specific. Everything goes to you, her only child. But we had to find you first. But we had to prove who you were. But $8 billion. But Elena couldn't even conceptualize that amount of money. But this morning, or was it yesterday, she'd been counting coins to buy diapers. But I can't. But she looked down at her daughters, now sleeping peacefully in the warm car. But this has to be a mistake, but people like me don't suddenly become princesses. But people like you? Catherine raised an eyebrow. But you mean people who've survived orphanhood, poverty, and abusive marriage, and somehow found the strength to keep fighting for their children? But she leaned forward. But you've been a princess all along, Elena, but you just didn't know it. But now it's time to claim what's yours. But the car had been moving while they talked, and Elena realized they were leaving the city. But where are we going? She asked. But I need to. I should. But she didn't even know what she needed to do. But report Derek's abandonment. But find a shelter. But her old life had ended the moment she stepped into this car. But her new one hadn't quite begun. But there's an Ashford property an hour north, Catherine explained. But a private estate, very secure. But you and the twins need rest, medical attention, safety. But tomorrow we'll begin the formal process of establishing your identity and transferring your inheritance. But tonight, you just need to be somewhere warm. But Elena nodded, too overwhelmed to protest. But she looked out the window as the city lights faded behind them, replaced by dark forests and empty highways. But everything felt surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's life. But the twins were real, warm and solid in her arms. But that grounded her, reminded her this wasn't a dream. But Derek, she said suddenly, but what happens when he finds out? But about the money, about who I really am. But Catherine's expression hardened. But what happens to Derek Matthews is entirely up to you. But I should warn you, the moment this news breaks, and it will break, he'll come back. But he'll claim he made a mistake, that he loves you, that he wants his family back. But we both know what he'll really want. But Elena felt something cold settle in her chest, but it wasn't fear. But it was clarity. But he threw us out into a blizzard, she said quietly. But he looked at his 6-day-old daughters like they were trash to be disposed of. But whatever happens to him, he deserves it. But perhaps, Catherine said, but revenge is a dish best served cold, as they say. And darling, you've just inherited the ability to serve the coldest dish imaginable. But they drove in silence for a while, and Elena found herself thinking about the past 8 years, but every sacrifice she'd made for Derek, every dream she'd deferred. But she'd worked herself to exhaustion to put him through training programs. But she'd agreed to stop working when he'd gotten insecure about her earning more. But she'd isolated herself from the few friends she'd had because he'd been jealous of her time. But she'd even agreed to try for a baby when money was tight because he'd promised it would fix everything. But instead, the pregnancy had been complicated. But the twins had come early, requiring weeks in the NICU. But the bills had piled up despite insurance, and Derek had started staying out later and later. But Elena had been so focused on keeping her babies alive that she'd missed the signs of his affair. Or maybe she'd seen them and just couldn't process one more crisis. But either way, the moment the twins had come home, healthy but demanding, Derek had cracked. But did you know? Elena asked suddenly. But when you were watching us for 3 weeks, did you know he was going to leave? But Catherine sighed. But we suspected. But his behavior patterns suggested someone preparing to abandon a situation. But we couldn't intervene without revealing ourselves, and the timing wasn't right. But I'm sorry, Elena. But if there had been any indication, he would put you in immediate danger. But you would have done what? Elena interrupted. But you couldn't have stopped him. But I had no legal recourse, no proof he was planning anything. But honestly, I should have seen it coming. But she looked down at the twins. But maybe I didn't want to see it. But maybe I wanted to believe the man I married was still in there somewhere. But he wasn't, Catherine said firmly. And you need to understand that, Elena. But the Derek Matthews who courted you was a performance. But the man who threw you out tonight was always there, just waiting for the mask to slip. But you didn't fail. But he did. But Elena wanted to believe that. But 8 years of conditioning made it hard. But Derek had spent their entire marriage subtly convincing her she was lucky he'd chosen her, that no one else would want an orphan with no family and no prospects. But he'd chipped away at her confidence so gradually she hadn't noticed until it was gone. But even tonight, Part of her brain insisted she must have done something wrong, must have failed him somehow. "But I need you to do something for me," Catherine said, pulling Elena from her thoughts. "But when we get to the estate, there will be staff, housekeepers, nurses, security. But they will treat you like royalty because that's what you are. But I need you to accept it. But don't apologize for existing. Don't minimize your needs. Don't try to make yourself smaller. But do you understand?" But Elena nodded, but she didn't understand. Not really. "But how did you go from being thrown away like garbage to accepting you were royalty? But how did you flip that switch in your brain?" "But I'll try," she said. "But that's all I ask," Catherine replied. But Elena, one more thing. But the world is going to be watching once this story breaks. But they'll want to know everything, where you've been, what happened to you, how you ended up in that situation tonight. But the narrative matters. But how we tell your story will shape your future." "But what do you mean?" Elena asked warily. "But are you asking me to lie?" "But never," Catherine said quickly. But there's a difference between telling the truth and being consumed by it. But Derek Matthews doesn't deserve to become famous as the man who abandoned a princess. But he doesn't deserve book deals or interviews or any spotlight at all. But if we're not careful, that's exactly what will happen. But so we need to be strategic about what we reveal and when." But Elena understood, but something bothered her. "But I don't want to hide," she said. "But I don't want to pretend the last 8 years didn't happen or that I haven't struggled. But other women are in situations like mine, worse even. But if my story can help them feel less alone—" And it will," Catherine interrupted, but on your terms, in your time, but not in some tabloid-feeding frenzy while you're still recovering from trauma and major surgery. But right now, we protect you and the twins. But later, when you're strong, you can decide how much to share." But the estate appeared like something from a fairy tale, a massive stone mansion set back from the road, surrounded by walls and gates. But security guards waved them through, and Elena caught glimpses of manicured lawns beneath the snow. But the car pulled up to a side entrance, and before Elena could even reach for the door handle, staff had materialized. But a nurse reached for the twins with capable hands, but Elena instinctively pulled back. "But it's all right," Catherine said gently. "But they're just taking them inside where it's warm. But you'll be right behind them. But darling, you need help walking. But you're exhausted and injured." But Elena had been so focused on the babies she'd forgotten about her own body. But the moment she tried to stand, her legs buckled and the driver caught her. But pain shot through her abdomen where the surgical incision was still healing. But Catherine had been right. She needed help. But she let them support her into the house, following the nurse who carried her daughters. But the interior was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, oil paintings in gilded frames. But everything spoke of wealth accumulated over generations. But the room they led her to was surprisingly intimate, a large bedroom with an attached nursery. But someone had already set up 2 bassinets, and the nurse was checking the twins over with professional efficiency. "But they're perfect," the nurse said, smiling at Elena. "But just cold and hungry, but we'll fix that. But Your Highness, you should rest. But Dr. Morrison is on his way to check your incision and ensure you're healing properly." "But Your Highness," but the title made Elena want to laugh or cry or both. "But I'm not," she started, but Catherine placed a hand on her arm. "But you are," she said firmly. "But get used to hearing it. But now let me show you the bathroom, but I suspect you'd like to clean up before the doctor arrives." But Elena looked down at herself for the first time since leaving her apartment. But her clothes were soaked through with snow, her hair a tangled mess. But she probably looked like exactly what she was, a desperate woman who'd nearly frozen to death. But the bathroom Catherine showed her was larger than the entire apartment she'd been evicted from. But a massive soaking tub, a glass shower that could fit 4 people, heated marble floors. "But there's clothing in the closet," Catherine said. "But I had them stocked with items in your size. But take your time, but we'll watch the babies." But alone for the first time in hours, Elena sat on the edge of the tub and let herself shake, but the adrenaline was wearing off, and in its place came the full weight of everything that had happened. But 12 hours ago, she'd been a married mother, trying to survive. But now she was apparently a princess, worth billions, rescued by a grandmother she'd never known existed. But it was too much, too fast, too impossible. But she forced herself to stand, to strip off the wet clothes, to step into the shower. But the hot water felt like heaven on her frozen skin, but it also made her injuries ache. But she looked down at her body, the still swollen belly, the angry red scar from the cesarean, the stretch marks that mapped her pregnancy. But this wasn't the body of a princess, but this was the body of someone who'd survived. But maybe that was worth more than perfection. But maybe that was what Catherine had meant about telling her story on her own terms. But Elena washed her hair with products that probably cost more than she'd spent on groceries in a month. But she dried off with towels softer than anything she'd ever owned. But in the closet she found pajamas in her exact size, along with robes and slippers and more clothing than she could process. But when she emerged, Catherine was sitting in a chair by the nursery door, watching the twins sleep in their bassinets. "But they're beautiful," she said softly. "But you did well, Elena. But despite everything, you brought 2 perfect lives into the world." "But I don't know how to do this," Elena admitted, sitting on the bed. "But I don't know how to be who you say I am." "But none of us do at first," Catherine said. "But I wasn't born royal either. But I married into the family, and it took years to learn the rules, the expectations, the way to navigate that world. But here's the secret. You don't have to be perfect, but you just have to be yourself and let the rest follow." But a knock on the door interrupted them. But the doctor had arrived, a kind-faced man in his 60s, who examined Elena's incision with gentle hands. "But you're healing well," he said. But you've clearly been through significant stress. But I'm prescribing rest, proper nutrition, and no lifting anything heavier than your babies for at least another month. But do you understand?" But Elena nodded, but she was thinking about how she'd been supposed to start looking for a job next week, but how she'd been planning to work with infants somehow, because she had no choice. "But what day is it?" she asked suddenly. "But what time?" "But it's 5 in the morning," Catherine said. "But you've been awake for over 24 hours. But you need to sleep, darling." But the twins," Elena started. "But we'll be fine," Catherine interrupted. "But we have night nurses who will bring them to you when they need to eat. But you must rest, Elena. But you can't care for them if you collapse." But Elena wanted to argue, but exhaustion hit her like a wave. But the bed was impossibly soft, and despite everything she felt safe for the first time in months. "But maybe years. But don't let anyone take them," she mumbled as her eyes closed. "But don't let Derek." "But no one is taking your children," Catherine said firmly. "But I promise you, Elena. But you're safe now. But all of you." But Elena drifted off to a voice singing softly, a lullaby in a language she didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. But she dreamed of palaces and blizzards, of crowns and empty apartments, of abandonment and rescue all tangled together. But when she woke 6 hours later, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and she could hear her daughters making soft, cooing sounds in the nursery. But for a moment she thought she'd dreamed everything. But then she saw the room, saw Catherine dozing in the chair, saw the nurse feeding Rose while Lily slept contentedly. But it was real. But all of it was impossible and real. But Elena got up carefully, her body still sore but more rested than it had been in weeks. "But there you are," Catherine said, waking immediately. "But how do you feel?" "But like I'm in someone else's life," Elena admitted. But also like I might be exactly where I'm supposed to be. But does that make sense?" "But perfect sense," Catherine said. But now we need to talk about next steps. But there's media camped outside the gates already." "But how?" Elena asked, alarmed. "But how did they find out?" "But they didn't, not specifically," Catherine explained. But a duchess arriving in that neighborhood at 3 in the morning and leaving with passengers doesn't go unnoticed. But someone photographed the car, posted it online, and now there's speculation. But we need to get ahead of this before it spins out of control. But Elena felt panic rising. "But I'm not ready to face cameras, but I don't know what to say." "But you don't have to say anything yet," Catherine said. "But we'll release a statement through official channels." But Elena, there's something else." "But Derek Matthews has been calling the estate?" "But apparently he saw the photos online too. But he's demanding to speak with you." But the mention of his name made Elena's blood run cold, but also ignited something hot and angry in her chest. "But already?" she asked. "But he threw us out less than 12 hours ago and now he's calling." "But, oh, it gets worse," Catherine said, pulling out her phone. "But he's already done an interview with a local news station. But he's claiming you kidnapped the twins, that you're mentally unstable, that he's been desperately searching for his family all night." But she showed Elena the video clip, and Elena felt sick. But there was Derek, his face a perfect mask of concern and grief. "But I just want my wife and daughters home safe," he was saying. "But Elena has been struggling with postpartum issues. But I'm worried she might hurt herself or the babies. But if anyone has seen them, please contact police immediately." "But that lying—" Elena couldn't even finish the sentence. "But he put us out in a blizzard. But he told me to figure it out myself. And now he's pretending he's some concerned father." "But he's terrified," Catherine said calmly. "But he saw the Duchess's car, realized you're connected to something big, and he's trying to get ahead of the story. But if he can paint himself as the victim, as the worried husband whose mentally ill wife ran off with his children, then when the truth comes out about your identity, he can claim he was just concerned about your well-being." "But that's insane," Elena said. "But no one will believe that." "But you'd be surprised what people believe when it's packaged correctly," Catherine said. But this is actually perfect. But this gives us the ammunition we need." "But for what?" Elena asked warily. But Catherine's smile was cold and calculating. "But to completely destroy any claim he might try to make on you or your inheritance. But we're going to hold a press conference at noon. But you're going to tell your story with medical records and witnesses to back it up. But you're going to show those photographs of your injuries, the texts where he demanded you leave, everything. And then we're going to announce who you really are." But she paused. But only if you're ready. But this is your story to tell, Elena. But no one can force you." But Elena thought about it, her mind racing. But part of her wanted to hide, to avoid the scrutiny, to somehow fade back into obscurity. But another part, the part that had survived abandonment and poverty and abuse, wanted to fight. "But what happens to Derek?" she asked. "But if we do this?" "But legally he's already committed abandonment," Catherine explained. "But with your testimony and evidence, you can secure full custody and ensure he has no parental rights. But as for financial claims, the inheritance is yours alone. It predates your marriage and comes from your biological family. But he has no legal right to any of it, but publicly. But he'll be exposed as a liar and an abuser. But his reputation will be destroyed. But no one will hire him. But his name will be synonymous with cruelty. But it was everything Elena had suffered redirected back at him. But was that justice or revenge? But will it help other women? She asked. But if I speak out, will it actually matter? But yes, Catherine said without hesitation. But because you're not just any woman now, but you're a princess who survived domestic abuse and abandonment. But you have a platform that few people in your situation ever get. But your story will reach millions and other women will see themselves in it. But they'll know they're not alone. But they'll know that abuse can happen to anyone regardless of who they are or what they're worth. But that decided it for Elena. But if her pain could prevent even one woman from suffering silently, it was worth facing the cameras. But, okay, she said, but I'll do it. But on one condition. My daughters are nowhere near any of this, but they don't get photographed, named, or turned into a spectacle. But absolutely, Catherine agreed. But they'll be here, safe and secure, while you face the world. But now we have several hours to prepare. But there are attorneys who need to brief you, publicists who need to coordinate the message, and you need to practice speaking to cameras without breaking down. But the next few hours were a whirlwind. But attorneys explained the legal protections they'd already put in place. But publicists coached her on how to speak clearly and calmly, even when discussing trauma. But Catherine brought in clothing, not the casual pajamas she'd worn to bed, but a simple, elegant dress in navy blue. But you're not trying to look like you've always been royal, she explained, but you're showing people who you were yesterday and who you are today, but authentic, but dignified. But makeup artists worked carefully, covering the dark circles under Elena's eyes, but leaving her looking natural. But we're not hiding anything, one of them said, but we're just making sure you feel comfortable facing those cameras. But at 11:30, they moved to a formal drawing room that had been set up as a press conference space. But dozens of cameras, reporters from major networks, lights that made Elena squint. But her heart was racing, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. But then she thought about Lily and Rose sleeping peacefully in the nursery. But she thought about all the nights she'd cried herself to sleep while Derek was working late. But she thought about the moment he'd shoved her out into the blizzard without looking back. But she sat down at the table, Catherine beside her, and faced the cameras. But the room went quiet, and a moderator explained the ground rules. Elena would make a statement, then take questions. But Elena took a deep breath and began. But my name is Elena Matthews, though that's about to change, she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. But last night, my husband of 8 years, Derek Matthews, physically removed me and our 6-day-old twin daughters from our home during a blizzard. But he did this despite knowing I had no money, no family, and was still recovering from major surgery. But he did this after months of emotional abuse and infidelity. But he did this because he decided our children were an inconvenience he didn't want to deal with. But she paused, letting that sink in. But what Derek didn't know, what I didn't know until last night, was that I am actually Elena Victoria Ashford, daughter of Crown Prince James and Princess Margaret of the Ashford royal family. But I was kidnapped as an infant and adopted by a couple who had no idea of my true identity. But they raised me as their own daughter until they died in an accident when I was 19. But I aged out of the foster system, met Derek, and built what I thought was a life. But the room was absolutely silent now. But last night, hours after Derek abandoned us, I was found by Dowager Duchess Catherine Ashford, who has been searching for me for nearly 3 decades. But she saved my life and the lives of my daughters. But she brought us to safety and revealed who I really am. But Elena pulled out papers from a folder in front of her. But I have medical records documenting the abuse. But I have text messages where Derek demanded I leave. But I have photographs of my injuries, and I have DNA evidence proving my identity. But she looked directly at the cameras now. But Derek Matthews went on television this morning claiming I'm mentally unstable, that I kidnapped our children, that he's been desperately searching for us. But every word of that is a lie. But he didn't know that when he said it. But he didn't know I had proof. But he didn't know I had protection. And he certainly didn't know that the woman he threw away like garbage was actually worth more than he could ever dream of. But Elena paused again, choosing her next words carefully. But I'm sharing this story not for revenge, though I won't pretend I'm not angry. But I'm sharing it because domestic abuse happens to women from all backgrounds. But rich, poor, educated, uneducated, famous, unknown, it doesn't discriminate. And often the world doesn't believe us. But often people wonder what we did to deserve it, why we didn't just leave, why we stayed as long as we did. But I'm here to say that I stayed because I loved who I thought he was. But I stayed because I'd been orphaned, and he represented the family I'd always wanted. But I stayed because I'd been conditioned to believe I was lucky anyone wanted me at all. But the moment he put my children at risk, I found the strength to survive without him. And I want other women in similar situations to know, you are stronger than you think, but you deserve better. And someday, somehow, there will be people who see your worth even if your abuser doesn't. But she took a breath. But as for Derek Matthews, he will face legal consequences for his actions. But more importantly, he will face the consequence of being known for exactly who he is. But no amount of money or power changes what he did. But both those things will ensure he can't do it to anyone else. But the questions came rapid fire after that. But how long had she known about her royal identity? But hours. What would happen to her inheritance? But it was legally protected. Did she plan to move to England and claim her title? But still deciding. What did she want people to know about domestic abuse? But that it's not the victim's fault, ever. But one reporter asked the question Elena had been dreading. But Mrs. Matthews, or Your Highness, how do you feel about your husband right now? But do you hate him? But Elena considered carefully. But I feel sorry for him, she said finally. But because he had a real chance at a real family, and he threw it away for reasons I'll never understand. But he had two beautiful daughters who will grow up without knowing their father, not because he died or because circumstances separated them, but because he chose to walk away. But he will live with that choice forever. And when they're old enough to ask questions, they'll find news footage and articles and they'll know exactly what kind of man he is. So no, I don't hate him. But I also don't forgive him. But some actions are simply unforgivable. But the press conference lasted another hour, with more questions, more details, more documentation presented. But by the time it ended, Elena was exhausted but also oddly exhilarated. But she'd told her truth, but she'd reclaimed her narrative. But Derek couldn't touch her now, but back in the estate she fed her daughters and watched the news coverage. But every major network was running the story. But Princess found after 27 years reveals abuse. But royal heir abandoned in blizzard by husband. But modern Cinderella story takes dark turn. But the coverage was overwhelmingly sympathetic, and already social media was turning Derek into a pariah. But his company had put him on immediate leave pending investigation. But his girlfriend, because of course there was a girlfriend, had already given an interview claiming she'd had no idea he was married with children. But he's been calling non-stop, Catherine said, appearing in the doorway. But he wants to apologize. but he wants to explain, but he wants another chance. But no, Elena said simply, but he doesn't get to explain, but he doesn't get to apologize his way back into our lives. But he made his choice. But now he gets to live with it. But what will you do now? Catherine asked. But you have resources and options you didn't have 24 hours ago. But where do you go from here? But Elena looked down at her daughters, then out the window at the estate's grounds covered in fresh snow. But I don't know yet, she admitted. But I know I'm going to raise my daughters to never accept being treated as less than their worth. But I'm going to use my platform to help other women escape abusive situations. And I'm going to make sure Derek Matthews knows every day for the rest of his life that he had something priceless and threw it away. But 3 months later, Elena stood in a courtroom as the judge finalized her divorce and terminated all of Derek's parental rights. But he'd tried to fight it, but the evidence was overwhelming and his credibility was destroyed. But he'd shown up in a wrinkled suit, looking nothing like the confident man who'd thrown her out into the snow. But their eyes met once across the courtroom, and Elena saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine regret. But it was too late for regret. But the judge's gavel came down, and Elena was free. But more than that, she was protected. But restraining orders were in place. But financial support was secured through her own inheritance, not his non-existent income. But her daughters would grow up knowing their worth, knowing their history, knowing they came from strength. But outside the courthouse, reporters waited, but Elena had learned how to handle them. But today represents the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, she said. But I hope my story reminds people that your circumstances don't define your worth. But 6 months ago, I was literally thrown away. But today, I'm a mother, a princess, and a survivor. But if I can go from being abandoned in a blizzard to standing here with my head high, then anyone can overcome their circumstances. But do you have any message for Derek Matthews? Someone shouted. But Elena smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. But I hope he finds whatever he's looking for in life, she said. But I hope he never forgets what he had and what he lost. But I hope that every success his daughters achieve, every milestone they reach, every moment of joy they experience, he knows he chose not to be part of it. But that's not revenge, but that's just consequences. But that night, in the nursery of her new home, a property she'd purchased herself, in her own name, with her own money, Elena rocked her daughters to sleep. But they were bigger now, more alert, starting to smile and recognize her face. But they would never know their father. But they would never understand what he'd done to them or why. But they would know they were loved, valued, and worthy of respect. But you're going to have an interesting story to tell someday, Elena whispered to them. But about the night everything changed. But about the moment our lives split into before and after. But I promise you this, you'll always know you were wanted, but you'll always know you were worth fighting for. And you'll never, ever settle for someone who treats you as disposable. But her phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. The trust funds are finalized, but education, healthcare, security, everything provided for. But you did it, darling. But you survived and then you thrived. But Elena sent back a simple response. We all did. But because it wasn't just her story anymore. But it was Lily and Rose's story too. But it was the story of every woman who'd been abandoned, abused, or discarded. But it was the story of survival and transformation. But it was the story of discovering your worth when the world and the people in it tried to convince you that you had none. But as she stood at the window watching snow fall gently over the grounds, Elena thought about Derek one last time. But he was out there somewhere, living with his choices, facing the consequences of his cruelty. But she wasn't thinking about him with anger anymore. But she was thinking about him with pity, but because he'd had a chance at something real and precious, and he'd been too blind to see it until it was too late. But the man who'd abandoned his wife and newborn twins in a blizzard, unaware she'd just inherited a royal family fortune, had gotten exactly what he deserved. But not jail time or financial ruin, though both were possible. But something worse. The knowledge that he'd thrown away the only things that mattered. And the woman he'd discarded? But she'd become everything he could never reach, touch, or claim. But she'd become untouchable in every sense of the word. But that, Elena decided as her daughters slept peacefully in their cribs, was the best revenge of all. But not destruction, but transcendence. But not vengeance, but victory. But she'd taken the worst moment of her life and transformed it into her greatest triumph. And Derek Matthews would spend the rest of his life knowing he'd been the catalyst for his own irrelevance. But the snow kept falling, covering the world in fresh whiteness, erasing old tracks and creating space for new paths. But Elena smiled, kissed her daughters goodnight, and walked toward the future, a future Derek couldn't touch, couldn't influence, couldn't darken, but a future that was entirely, beautifully, powerfully hers. But 5 years had passed since that frozen night, and Elena Victoria Ashford stood in the grand ballroom of Ashford Palace, watching her daughters chase each other between the legs of diplomats and dignitaries. But Lily wore a miniature tiara that kept slipping over her eyes, while Rose had already abandoned hers in favor of climbing on the marble statues that lined the corridor. But they were 5 years old now, wild and confident and utterly fearless. Everything Elena had promised herself they would be. But, Your Highness, the ambassador from Sweden would like a word, her assistant whispered. But Elena held up a hand. But, give me 5 minutes, she said. But I need to actually parent before I... Princess. But she crossed the ballroom, her gown, a deep emerald that had cost more than Derek's annual salary used to be, trailing behind her. But, Rose Ashford, if you break that statue, you're paying for it out of your allowance, she called. But Rose giggled and scrambled down, running to hug her mother's legs. But Mama, we're playing princesses, she protested. But real princesses don't follow rules. But real princesses absolutely follow rules, Elena corrected gently. But they just also make some of the rules. But big difference. But she scooped both girls into her arms, though they were getting heavy for that now. But go find Grandmother Catherine. But she promised you chocolate before dinner, didn't she? But the twins squealed and took off, and Elena watched them go with a mixture of pride and terror. But they were so much like her, resilient, stubborn, unbreakable. But they also had something she'd never had at their age. Absolute security. But they knew who they were. But they knew where they belonged. But they knew they were loved without condition or caveat. But they're beautiful, a voice said behind her, and Elena turned to find Marcus Wellington, the British Parliament member she'd been seeing for the past 6 months. But he was kind, patient, and, most importantly, had no interest in her money. But he'd made his own fortune in tech before entering politics. But, thank you for coming, she said, accepting his kiss on her cheek. But I know these royal functions bore you to tears. But nothing about you bores me, he said simply. But I did want to give you this before the evening gets too chaotic. But he handed her a folded newspaper. But page 6. But I thought you should see it before someone else mentions it. But Elena's stomach dropped, but she opened the paper anyway. But the headline made her breath catch. Where are they now? Derek Matthews, 5 years after the scandal. But there was a photograph, Derek looking significantly older, grayer, harder around the edges, but the article detailed his fall from grace with almost clinical precision. But fired from his tech job within days of the press conference, but unable to find employment anywhere in his field, but currently working at a hardware store in a small town 2 states away, but divorced from the girlfriend he'd left Elena for, but living alone in a studio apartment, but estranged from his own parents who'd publicly denounced his actions. But he gave an interview, Marcus said quietly, but in the article. But he talks about his regrets. But Elena found the quote, "Not a day goes by that I don't think about what I destroyed. I had a family, a wife who loved me, 2 daughters who would have been my world, but I was too blind, too selfish, too stupid to see it. I thought I wanted freedom, but what I really wanted was to run from responsibility. Now I have all the freedom in the world, and it's the loneliest thing imaginable. I see my daughter's pictures sometimes. The princess shares them carefully, protecting their privacy but letting the world see how beautiful they are. They look happy, they look loved, they look like they've never missed me at all, and that's what I deserve." But the article continued. Matthews has attempted to reach out to his former wife multiple times over the years, but his letters are returned unopened. He has no legal right to contact with his daughters, those rights having been terminated by court order. When asked what he would say to Princess Elena, if given the chance, Matthews broke down. "I'm sorry doesn't even begin to cover it. I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me, and I did it deliberately, cruelly, in the coldest way possible. I threw her and our newborn babies out into a blizzard. What kind of person does that? I've spent 5 years trying to answer that question, and I still don't understand who I was that night, but I know who I'm not anymore. I'm not a husband, not a father, not even really a person worth knowing. I'm just someone who serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't appreciate what you have until it's gone." But Elena folded the paper carefully, her hands steady even though her heart was racing. "But how do you feel?" Marcus asked, and she appreciated that he didn't assume. But he didn't tell her she should feel vindicated or sympathetic or anything else. But he just asked. "But I feel—" Elena paused, searching for the right word. "But indifferent, mostly. But maybe a little sad that he wasted so much of his life on regret instead of rebuilding. But also relieved that he finally understands the magnitude of what he did." But she looked up at Marcus. "But does that make me cold? But it makes you human," he said. "But he traumatized you, Elena. But you don't owe him forgiveness or sympathy. But I know you. You're probably wondering if you should reach out." But Elena laughed softly. "But you do know me. But no, I'm not going to reach out. But that chapter is closed. But he made his choices, and I've made mine. But my daughters don't need a father who abandoned them, suddenly appearing in their lives with apologies and explanations. But they need stability, security, and love, all of which they have." "But have you told them about him yet?" Marcus asked. "But they're getting to the age where they'll start asking questions." "But we've told them an age-appropriate version," Elena said. "But they know their biological father made bad choices and isn't part of our lives. But they know it's not their fault. But they know they have a whole family who loves them. Catherine, me, the entire Ashford extended family, the staff who've watched them grow up. But they're not lacking for father figures either. The security chief teaches them self-defense. The head gardener shows them how to grow things. The stable master is teaching them to ride." But she smiled. And they have you, when you're around. But I've seen how they light up when you visit." But Marcus looked uncomfortable, but pleased. "But I'm not trying to replace." "But I know," Elena interrupted gently. And that's exactly why you're good for them. but you're not trying to be anything except yourself. But you're patient with their questions. You treat them like people instead of obligations, and you make me happy. But they see that, and it matters." "But where is this going?" Marcus asked suddenly. "But between us, I mean. But I know we've been taking it slow, being careful because of the girls and the media attention. But Elena, I'm in love with you, but I have been for months. And I need to know if you feel the same or if I'm just a comfortable presence while you heal." But Elena's heart was pounding now for an entirely different reason. But she'd sworn after Derek that she'd never let anyone have power over her heart again. But somehow, carefully and slowly, Marcus had found his way past her defenses. "But I'm terrified," she admitted. "But the last time I loved someone, he destroyed me. But he made me doubt my worth, my judgment, my right to exist. And even though I've rebuilt myself, even though I'm stronger now, there's still a part of me that's afraid." "But of what?" Marcus asked gently. "But of being wrong again," Elena said. "But of choosing someone who'll hurt me or hurt my daughters. But of letting someone in only to discover they were just interested in the title or the money or the access to power." "But I can't promise I'll never hurt you," Marcus said honestly. "But people hurt each other sometimes, even when they love each other. But I can promise I'll never abandon you. But I can promise I'll never make you feel small or worthless or disposable. And I can promise that every single day I'll show up and choose you and those girls, even when it's hard, even when it's inconvenient, even when the world is watching." But Elena felt tears stinging her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "But that's all I needed to hear," she said. Because yes, Marcus, but I love you too. But I've been too afraid to say it, too afraid to admit that I was ready to try again. But I am. But with you, I am." But he kissed her then, gentle and sure, and somewhere across the ballroom Catherine caught her eye and smiled knowingly. But the old Duchess had been trying to set them up for months, insisting Elena deserved happiness beyond just success and revenge. But apparently grandmothers always knew best. But the evening continued with speeches and dances and diplomatic conversations that meant nothing and everything. But as midnight approached, Elena found herself in the quieter wing of the palace, looking at the portrait that had been commissioned 2 years earlier. But it showed her with Lily and Rose as toddlers, all 3 of them wearing crowns, all 3 of them smiling. But the artist had captured something essential, not just their royal status, but their unbreakable bond. "But, Mama?" Rose's voice came from the doorway, sleepy and small. "But I couldn't sleep. But can I stay with you?" But Elena held out her arms, and both twins, because where one went, the other followed, padded over in their princess nightgowns. "But what's wrong, loves?" she asked. "But bad dreams." "But no," Lily said. But Rose wanted to ask you something, and she was too scared to ask alone." "But I'm not scared," Rose protested. But then she looked at Elena with those huge eyes that saw too much. "But, Mama, why don't we have a daddy? But everyone at school has daddies, but some have 2 mommies or 2 daddies or just 1 parent, but we have you and Grandmother Catherine and Uncle Marcus sometimes, but no actual daddy." But Elena had known this question was coming, but it still made her chest tight. But she led them to a velvet couch and settled both girls on her lap, even though they were really too big for that now. "But you did have a biological father," she said carefully. But he made some very bad choices before you were even old enough to remember him. But he decided he didn't want to be a parent, and he left. But that was his choice, not yours. But it had nothing to do with how lovable or wonderful or special you are." "But did he leave because we cried too much?" Lily asked, her voice tiny. "But because I know I cried a lot when I was a baby." "But no, sweetheart," Elena said firmly. "But all babies cry. but that's normal and natural and not something that makes parents leave. But he left because he was selfish and scared and not ready to be the kind of parent you deserved. And honestly, I'm glad he left when he did, instead of staying and being mean or cruel or making our lives unhappy. But do you miss him? Rose asked. But even though he was mean. But Elena thought about it honestly. But I miss who I thought he was, she said. But I miss the idea of the family I wanted us to be. But I don't miss the actual person, because the actual person hurt us badly. And the amazing thing is that we survived without him. But we built a beautiful life with people who actually love us and want to be here. But that's better than having someone who stays but doesn't really care. But is Uncle Marcus going to be our daddy? Lily asked hopefully. But because we like him. But he's nice and he brings us books and he doesn't talk to us like we're stupid. But Elena smiled. But Uncle Marcus and I are very close friends, she said carefully. But maybe someday that will turn into something more. But even if it does, he'll never try to replace the father who left or pretend that what happened didn't happen. But he'll just be someone who loves us and wants to be part of our family. But is that okay? But both girls nodded, satisfied for now. But, Mama, Rose said after a moment, but when we grow up, will we have to marry princes? But you don't have to marry anyone, Elena said firmly. But princess or not, you get to choose your own lives. But you get to decide who you love and how you live and what makes you happy. But that's the difference between being royal and being a prisoner to royalty. But we have power and privilege, but we also have choice. But never forget that. But good, Lily said, but because I want to be a veterinarian. But princesses can be veterinarians, right? But princesses can be anything, Elena assured her. But the crown doesn't define you, but you define what the crown means. But she walked them back to their rooms, tucking them into their respective beds and kissing their foreheads. But as she turned to leave, Rose called out one more time. But, Mama, but I'm glad it's just us. But, well, us and Grandmother Catherine and Uncle Marcus and everyone else. But I'm glad the mean daddy left, because now we have you all to ourselves, and you're the best mama in the whole world. But Elena's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. But I'm glad it's us too, baby. But now sleep. But tomorrow we have that charity event at the children's hospital. But back in the main ballroom, the party was winding down, and Catherine found Elena standing by the window looking out at the palace grounds. But you're thinking about him, Catherine said, and it wasn't a question. But the article. But not really, Elena said. Or maybe I am, but not the way you think. But I'm thinking about how different my life could have been. But if he'd just been a little bit kinder, a little bit stronger, a little bit more committed, we might still be together. But I might never have found out who I really was. But the girls might have grown up in that tiny apartment with a father who resented them, instead of in a palace with people who adore them. But are you saying you're grateful he was cruel? Catherine asked carefully. But I'm saying I'm grateful for where I ended up, Elena clarified. But I'm not grateful for the trauma or the pain or the night I thought we might freeze to death. But I'm grateful that his worst brought out my best. But I'm grateful that losing everything taught me what actually matters. And I'm grateful that my daughters will never, ever settle for someone who treats them as disposable, because they've seen what happens when you do. But Catherine nodded slowly. But he could have had all of this, she said, gesturing at the ballroom, the palace, the life they'd built. But if he'd just been decent, but if he'd just held on a few more hours, he would have been married to a princess worth billions. But that's the thing, Elena said. But even if he'd found out about the inheritance before he threw us out, it wouldn't have fixed what was broken in him. But he would have stayed for the money, not for us. but he would have been resentful and controlling and jealous of everything I had that he didn't. But it would have been a different kind of misery, just with better furniture. But you've become quite wise, Catherine observed. But that girl I picked up in the blizzard 5 years ago, she was strong, but she didn't quite believe it yet. But now you carry yourself like you've always known who you are. But I had good teachers, Elena said, squeezing the old woman's hand. But you saved my life that night. But not just physically, but in every way that mattered. But you gave me back my identity, my power, my future, but I'll never be able to repay that. But you repay it every day, Catherine said. But every time you use your platform to help abused women find resources and escape. But every time you speak honestly about your experience instead of hiding behind royal protocol. But every time you show those girls that their worth isn't determined by whether some man values them. But that's how you repay it, darling, but by being exactly who you are. But Marcus appeared then, ready to leave for the evening. But walk me out, he asked Elena, and she agreed. But in the relative privacy of the palace entrance, he took her hands. But I meant what I said earlier, he told her. But I'm all in, Elena. But whenever you're ready, however you want this to look, I'm here. But I know, she said. And I'm ready. But not for anything rushed or public or dramatic, but for something real. But something that we build slowly and carefully because it matters too much to rush. But I can work with slow and careful, he said, kissing her forehead. But I'm a patient man. But I waited 6 months just to tell you I love you. But after he left, Elena walked back through the palace, checking on her daughters one more time before heading to her own chambers. But in her private study, she kept a locked drawer that contained everything from that night 5 years ago. The clothes she'd worn, frozen and threadbare. But the hospital records from the twins' birth. But the police report from when she'd formally charged Derek with abandonment. But the DNA results that had changed her entire world. And one thing more. A letter Derek had sent 3 years ago, one of many she'd returned unopened. But this one she'd opened by accident before she'd seen who it was from. But she didn't read it often, but tonight she pulled it out. But the handwriting was shaky, desperate. Elena, I know I have no right to contact you. I know I destroyed everything good in my life. But I need you to know that not a day goes by that I don't regret what I did. I see your picture in the news sometimes, looking so beautiful and confident and happy, and I'm glad. I'm glad you found your real family. I'm glad you're giving our daughters the life I never could have provided. But I'm not glad about anything else. I'm not glad I hurt you. I'm not glad I missed watching them grow. I'm not glad I became the villain in a story that could have been about love. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that you were always worth more than I treated you. Always. Derek. But Elena folded the letter back up and locked it away. But maybe someday she'd show it to the girls when they were old enough to understand complexity and contradiction, that someone could be genuinely remorseful and still not deserve a place in your life, but that you could acknowledge someone's pain without taking responsibility for fixing it. But that closure didn't always come from reconciliation. Sometimes it came from simply moving forward. But her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Thank you for tonight, for trusting me with your heart. I won't break it. But Elena smiled and typed back, I know you won't, but if you did, I'd survive it. That's the difference between now and then. I know I can survive anything. But she got ready for bed in a bathroom that still sometimes made her dizzy with its luxury. But she put on silk pajamas that cost more than a month's rent in her old apartment. But she climbed into a bed large enough to fit 5 people comfortably. But and she lay there thinking about the strange, terrible, wonderful journey that had brought her here. But 5 years ago, she'd been thrown away like trash. But she'd stood in a blizzard thinking her story might end there. But she'd been so broken, so convinced of her own worthlessness, that Derek's abandonment had almost made sense to her. But of course he'd leave. Who would want to stay with someone like her? But now she knew better. But now she understood that his leaving had nothing to do with her worth and everything to do with his character. But now she had 2 daughters who would never doubt their value because they had a mother who'd learned that lesson the hardest way possible. But now she had wealth and power and platform, and she used it every single day to lift up women who were where she'd been. But the foundation she'd started, Ashford Rising, had helped thousands of women escape domestic violence, but she'd opened shelters, funded legal aid, created job training programs, and established a 24-hour hotline. But every woman who called that number and found help was another victory, another life saved, another family given a chance that Elena had almost been denied. But tomorrow she'd visit the children's hospital with the twins, but they'd bring toys and books and their own particular brand of chaos to kids who were fighting for their lives. But the girls would wear their tiaras because it made the other children smile. But they'd use their privilege to bring joy, which was exactly what Elena wanted them to understand privilege was for. But next week she'd give a speech at the United Nations about domestic violence and economic abuse. But world leaders would listen because she was a princess. But they'd act because her story was undeniable. But she'd become the voice for women who couldn't yet speak for themselves. But, and in all of it, Derek Matthews would be nothing more than a footnote. But the man who'd almost destroyed her had instead launched her into a life beyond his imagination. But his cruelty had unlocked her power. But his abandonment had led to her salvation. But his worst moment had become her origin story. But she wondered sometimes what he thought when he saw her on television, giving speeches, attending galas, changing policies. But did he recognize the woman he'd thrown away? But did he understand what he'd lost? But did it eat at him every day, or had he found some kind of peace? But it didn't really matter. But his feelings were his own to process. But his regrets were his own to carry. But Elena had spent enough of her life worrying about what Derek thought, what Derek wanted, what Derek needed. But that version of her had died in the blizzard 5 years ago. But what had emerged was someone who knew her worth, protected her peace, and built the life she deserved. But as she drifted off to sleep, her last thoughts weren't of Derek or the past or what might have been, but they were of tomorrow, of her daughter's laughter, of Marcus's steady presence, of Catherine's wisdom, of the women she'd helped through her foundation, of the life she was building brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. But the girl who'd been abandoned in the snow was gone. But in her place was a woman who'd learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing. But that sometimes being thrown away is actually being set free. But that sometimes the person who hurts you most does you the greatest favor by revealing exactly who they are before you waste any more of your life on them. But Elena Victoria Ashford, princess and survivor, mother and advocate, woman who'd died in a blizzard and been reborn in a limousine, closed her eyes and smiled. But tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new moments to prove that she was exactly who she'd always been meant to be. But and Derek Matthews would be exactly where he'd always deserved to be, alone with his regrets, watching from the outside as the woman he'd destroyed rebuilt herself into someone magnificent. But that was justice. But not revenge, not cruelty, not vindictiveness, but just the natural consequence of his own actions, reflected back at him every time he saw her face on a screen or in a newspaper. But just the reality that some mistakes can't be fixed, some actions can't be undone, some losses can't be recovered. But he'd had everything and thrown it away. But she'd had nothing and built an empire. But that was the real story, the one that mattered, the one that would be told long after everyone forgot his name. But the princess who survived, who thrived, who proved that your worst moment doesn't have to define you, it can refine you instead. But, and somewhere in a small studio apartment 2 states away, Derek Matthews turned off the television where footage of Elena's United Nations speech was replaying. But he sat in the dark, living with his choices, drowning in his regrets. But he'd thrown away a princess, and she'd become a queen. But he'd never get close enough to apologize. But he'd never get close enough to explain. But he'd never get close enough to matter. But that was exactly as it should be. But some doors, once closed, were meant to stay closed forever. But some chapters, once ended, couldn't be reopened. But some people, once hurt, were absolutely right to never give you a second chance. But Elena Victoria Ashford, princess and survivor, slept peacefully while the man who'd tried to destroy her lay awake with his demons. But, and in the grand balance of the universe, that felt exactly right.